The end of the 2024 NFL season is rapidly approaching. Which players deserve Pro Bowl recognitions for their performances thus far for a trying season for the Dolphins?
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft lead for the 33rd team. Want to give a shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. We don't just say it, we live it. And if you're not an everydayer, welcome to the program. You picked a good one. We're looking at the Dolphins as a roster and performance expectations, who has exceeded, who has met, who has not met, kind of the standard based on who you thought your best players were this season. That's really what we're looking at here today on the show. Pro Bowl voting is underway, and we're going to be asking ourselves some tough and honest questions about who is deserving of those kinds of honors. And I know the Pro Bowl is an event that has seen its luster lost over the past 10 years or so. It's become the Pro Bowl games, and there's a flag football game, and they struggled with the competitive nature of actually playing a game and incentivizing the players to play. But it is ultimately, at the end of the day, you are recognized amongst your peers, your players and coaches and the fans for your merit on the field as being one of the best at your position. And there's player incentives and financial incentives that are baked into making Pro Bowls and collecting those honors. So it's not nothing, but it's not what it once was. And I'm readily willing to acknowledge that. Now we have to get ready for the Dolphins have 4 games left to play this season. They're starting with Houston in week 15. We have crossover Thursday with Locked On Texans. Coming tomorrow to kind of start to set the stage for this game. But I wanted to just touch on, because the Pro Bowl window opened on Monday, or the final 2 weeks opened on Monday, in which you can vote on X by tweeting first and last name of a player, tagging the player's official Twitter handle, or creating a hashtag using a player's first and last name with the hashtag Pro Bowl vote. And you can vote on social media for your favorite players. And as much as I would like to vote for every player, I don't think every player, for the Dolphins in particular, should have Pro Bowl honors, because it is a prestige thing relative to your peers. And I cover the league with Locked On NFL Scouting. And so not being a homer or somebody who's overly optimistic or sells you hopium, or somebody who lies to you to feel good about the team, we have honest conversations on this program. And that's what we're going to do here on the show. And we're going to start with, we have some breaking news as I am recording that we'll touch on at the end of the show, but we're going to jump into the Dolphins roster. And we'll look at the offensive side of the ball and ask yourself the question: what players at their specific positions do I feel warrant Pro Bowl honors, knowing full well that a good portion of the actual Pro Bowl voting comes off of reputation and not necessarily true merit isolated within that year? I think the best candidate that you have for the Miami Dolphins to make the Pro Bowl on the offensive side of the football is Aaron Brewer. His play this year, game over game, has been phenomenal. He has been consistent. He has been an impact player on the offensive line. The things that he is athletically capable of doing is rare. And this scheme and system is maximizing the player that Aaron Brewer is. So that is when I think about Pro Bowl caliber performances on the offensive side of the ball, Aaron Brewer's name is the first one that comes to mind for me. He's an electric player. And he's been everything that you hoped he would be, stepping into a system that didn't ask him to block for 3.1 seconds per pass attempt. Now, traditional Pro Bowl recognition and thought process would say, well, Tyreek Hill, regardless of what Tyreek Hill's production is. But I think relative to the expectations of Tyreek Hill versus the expectations of Aaron Brewer, I think Brewer has far exceeded and transcended the narrative about who he was as a player in a good way and in a good light. And I think that's the kind of performance that, for me, should get recognized with Pro Bowl honors. The same for Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith, if you were looking at receiving for tight ends this season, I have the receiving numbers up. Brock Bowers, with 118 targets and 87 catches, has 933 yards and 4 touchdowns this year. Jonnu Smith is the second tight end in the AFC conference from a receiving yards perspective, and he's got about 40 less targets than Brock Bowers does, and he has more touchdowns than Brock Bowers does. And some of that is the quarterback play and so on and so forth. But Travis Kelce has 8.5 yards per catch this season. He has 2 touchdowns this season. I will readily acknowledge, from a name and brand value recognition standpoint, Travis Kelce would probably get more votes than what Jonnu Smith did. But as far as a resume that is actively deserving of being honored with a Pro Bowl nod, I think Jonnu Smith is one of the top 2 tight ends in the AFC this year. And that comes with acknowledgement that he's not a particularly dynamic or effective blocker. But that's not what he's in the offense to do. And you try to mitigate those reps by using him as a receiver, as the Dolphins have, and they have greatly reaped the rewards and the benefits of that. For me, that's probably the only 2 guys on the offensive side of the ball that I would definitively say have firm Pro Bowl resumes. Tua Tagovailoa is playing the best football of his career, and he made the Pro Bowl last year. But when you miss a month of the season, and Joe Burrow's playing the way that he is playing, he's playing the best football of his career, it feels like. And the Bengals just can't stop anybody defensively. And then you have Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. I think that, for me, is probably the top 3 as far as like Pro Bowl resumes. There's no question that Tua Tagovailoa, especially if one of those guys is representing in the Super Bowl, you may have an alternative opportunity. But then there's Patrick Mahomes. And Pat's not been great statistically this year, but he's Pat Mahomes. So predictively, I can't sit here and say I think Pat Mahomes, who amongst the NFL's passing leaders, is the only quarterback in the top 12 in yards with a yards per attempt average of less than 7 yards per attempt. And he also is one of just a handful of guys with less than 20 or 20 touchdown passes or fewer with double-digit interceptions. His passer rating is the second lowest amongst the top 12 quarterbacks in passing in the NFL this year. But he's Pat Mahomes, right? I think Tua, realistically, at worst, is 5th in the AFC like Pro Bowl resume landscape, but that month of missed games is really going to hurt when it comes down to sorting out who actually gets the votes and who actually gets the honors. Now, if he continues to throw for 300 yards and multiple touchdowns per game, every game over the final 4 games, he could probably make this thing real darn interesting. Because the past 6 weeks or so is the best stretch of play we've ever seen from Tua, in my opinion. But as far as guys that I think open or shut, you think about where the threshold is of how many players make a Pro Bowl roster, with air quotes, at their respective positions. I think Brewer's been the best center in the AFC, and I think Jonnu Smith's been a top 2 tight end. Those, for me, would be the guys that I would absolutely pound the table for. And you consider the guys that would expect to have been in the conversation would also have included Teron Armstead, who's been excellent this season, but now is banged up. And Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill as guys who I think, I told you before the year they were going to catch 1,300 yards worth of passes, you wouldn't have batted an eye, but they haven't been there. And some of that's because of Tua and the interruption that we had when Tua didn't play and went on injured reserve for a month. Predictively, I think Miami maybe gets Jonnu Smith, and I wouldn't be surprised if Tyreek Hill or Teron Armstead still got the recognition anyway. But as far as guys that I would really pound the table and advocate for offensively, it's Aaron Brewer and Jonnu Smith. Now, defensively, things get a little more interesting because I think there's a few more names to have the conversation about predictively whether they will or won't. We'll get into that next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so make sure that you stick with us. Today's episode is sponsored by Built Rewards. If you're a renter, listen up. This is a total game changer. Thanks to Built, you can now earn points on rent payments just like you do with groceries or travel. Paying rent now comes with serious perks, and it is completely free to join. You can earn valuable Built points on your rent and everyday spending at no extra cost. Redeem points for flights, hotel stays, even future rent payments. With over 500 airlines and 700,000 hotels in their program, the possibilities are endless. Access unique experiences that are exclusive to Built members. I love using Built points for travel. I do a lot of travel for the scouting work that I do. Built makes it easy to turn rent into rewards. If you're already paying rent, why not make it work for you? Start earning points on rent you're already paying by going to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnfl. That's joinbuilt.com/lockedonnfl. Make sure to use our link so we know we sent you. Don't wait. Start earning rewards today. Defensive players that I think merit consideration for the Pro Bowl. Like legitimate, like I would really pound the table for these guys to go. I think the first name that comes to my mind is Zach Sieler. Zach Sieler, as things currently stand, is second in the AFC in sacks by a defensive tackle. He only trails Cam Hayward, who has 8. Zach has 6. From a tackles for loss perspective, amongst defensive tackles in the AFC, Zach Sieler is tied with Cam Hayward for first. His play this year without Christian Wilkins and in a front that has more complementary players, but not a first-round pick snap taker that's going to go on to get a $27 million a year contract that also plays 80+% of the snaps. Zach proving that his play and his resume transcends who you're lining him up next to, and the metrics show very favorably for Zach as far as the splits when Calais Campbell is on the field, but also when Calais Campbell's off the field. As long as Zach Sieler is on the field, the Dolphins' run defense is significantly better. He's been an awesome player, and he is an embodiment, I think, of exactly what a Pro Bowl player should be, for the impact that he brings, the volume of snaps that he plays. You felt his impact or you felt how impactful he was in a similar way to what you felt with Tua Tagovailoa on offense when Tua wasn't out there for 4 games. When Zach Sieler wasn't out there for 2 games, you felt the difference, and it frankly probably cost you both of those games. The Arizona and second Buffalo game, I think if Zach Sieler plays, the defensive performances in both games are better, and you were the last play of the game on both games from winning the football game or having an opportunity to win the football game. So Zach Sieler for me is a slam dunk. I think Jalen Ramsey, and I know he's coming off of a game that he didn't have a particularly strong performance, but I think Jalen Ramsey is probably the best example of a player that had elite expectations that has played at an elite level this year. Look, sometimes you get the bear and sometimes the bear gets you. And Garrett Wilson was the bear to Jalen Ramsey on Sunday against the Jets. Got left on an island a couple of times, and Garrett Wilson's a very, very good, probably top 12, top 10 NFL wide receiver. Sometimes you're going to get got, and Jalen Ramsey got by Garrett Wilson, and there's no shame in that. You look at the entire body of work for Jalen Ramsey and the guys that he's matched up with, particularly guys with size, guys with strength and straight line speed, and the way that he's been able to defend those guys all season. You go back to DK Metcalf, you go back to Brian Thomas Jr., those guys that are big, tall, long, powerful, and explosive vertical guys. Ramsey in those reps was very good. Brian Thomas caught a touchdown and DK Metcalf both caught a touchdown against the Dolphins. Neither one of those were Jalen Ramsey in assignment in responsibility. The Brian Thomas one was Jordan Poyer sucked up on a hook route on the front end of the goal line in cover 2 and vacated all the space behind it. And Ramsey, who was actually responsible in part for covering the player that was down on the goal line, tried to sink off and make the play. So it's tough because you get these next-gen stats about player who's the closest player in coverage at the point of the catch, but that doesn't mean it's his responsibility. I can think of 2 plays in the first month of the season for Jalen Ramsey that were explosive plays that Dolphins gave up where he wasn't the guy that was responsible for either one of them. That one against Brian Thomas was a touchdown pass. And then the Josh Allen scramble to Ty Johnson that got tackled down at the 1-yard line by Jalen Ramsey. You had another half-field safety who on the scramble drill just completely vacated his assignment as a deep half player. And the running back who's running a rail out of the backfield turns and flips upfield and gets behind everybody because the deep safety loses his mind and cuts somebody else in front. So Ramsey, with what he's done in run support, what he's done as a tackler this year, and I know he had, 3 missed tackles against the Packers, but the full body of work has been there. I think he's been your most consistent defensive player all season long, aside of Calais Campbell and Zach Sieler. I think Calais, I wish he played more to have like a legitimate Pro Bowl candidacy. He's been everything you dreamed he would be and more as a defensive player. But I don't know that I would sit here and say, based off the snap counts and the rotation that he's a part of as a rotational player, that he's somebody I think would pound the table for Pro Bowl honors. I think those are probably your 4 best candidates, are Aaron Brewer, Jonnu Smith, Zach Sieler, and Jalen Ramsey. I would also shout out Jordan Brooks, who is tied for 13th or tied for 12th in the league in total tackles with 113. Amongst linebackers, like off-ball linebackers, he's in the top 10 in tackles for loss. He has 10. He just had a sack against Aaron Rodgers. He's been a very active player, and he plays his rear end off. I think you look at linebackers and production for linebackers, I think it gets a little muddy because there's guys that carry high reputations. There's guys who have been super productive players like Roquan Smith, I think, is a great example, who I don't think is having his best season in Baltimore, but he's Roquan Smith with the reputation that Roquan Smith has. I think you have Zaire Franklin in Indianapolis. Robert Spillane with the Raiders was a great player last year that I think went a little bit under the radar and got slept on a little bit, and he's having an encore season this year that maybe is not as productive, but he's still in the top 10 in the NFL in tackles. Dion Henley with the Chargers, that team being an upstart team, and he's a young player who's a former safety out of Washington State, and is really coming into his own. He's got 122 tackles and has 6 passes defensed, showing off that background as a safety. Jordan Brooks has 5 passes defensed this season. I think Jordan Brooks in isolation merits Pro Bowl honors as well. I just think the numbers are probably going to be stacked a little bit too far against him for him to predictively get it. If I had to rank them in order, the group of 5 that I just had, I would probably say that Aaron Brewer, I think, is the most deserving because I think he's been the best player in the conference at his position. And then I would probably say Jalen Ramsey. And then I would say Zach Sieler. And then I would say Jonnu Smith, with Jordan Brooks coming in 5th on this list. If I was going to do a cool half dozen, I'd probably put Tua as the next name on the list as the 6th player off the Dolphins roster as far as ranking like their merit for a Pro Bowl honor this year. With obviously that being a very different thing than predictively looking at the conference landscape and how many players get spots on the actual Pro Bowl games rosters. Now, we had some news that came out. It was announced as I was just sitting down and getting ready to record, courtesy of the league meetings that is happening. We're going to get into that, touch on that with what we basically know. And it has to do with equity with the team and Stephen Ross. So stay tuned. We're going to get into that next year on Locked On Dolphins. Dolphins fans, if you're like me, your holiday shopping list is, let's be honest, not done yet. It's far from complete. And if that's the case, I have the perfect gift for the passionate sports fan in your life. Perhaps you've heard of Ice Shaker. Ice Shaker is now officially licensed with the NFL, NHL, NBA, NCAA, and Major League Baseball, and makes for the idea gift. Created and used by the Gronkowski brothers, Ice Shakers has sold over 1 million bottles. They've changed the game with workout bottles. This is the gift that you have been looking for. Go to iceshaker.com and use code LOCKEDONNFL at checkout to save 25% off of your order. This is kitchen-grade stainless steel. This is not the cheap plastic bottles with the metal grate ball that clanks around when you shake it up. There is a patented twist and agitator that breaks up powders, but it is silence when you shake it, so you're not letting the whole gym know you're getting ready to take a sip. And you can mix all kinds of drinks in here. The stainless steel does not absorb odor like the plastic bottles do. You can order your team branded bottles today at iceshaker.com and use code LOCKEDONNFL for 25% off your order. Ice Shaker, show your support for your teams with the best branded workout bottles on the market. Ice Shakers. The Miami Dolphins, this is from the team page as of 10:48 a.m. on December 11th. Miami Dolphins announced sale of limited interest to Ares Management for continued investment into South Florida and the Ross Sports and Entertainment portfolio. I'll read the lead here and the quote from Stephen Ross. In a landmark deal, Miami Dolphins and chairman of the board, Stephen M. Ross, have announced a strategic investment by Ares Management Funds and Brooklyn Nets owner Joe Tsai and Oliver Weisberg. In addition to the Miami Dolphins, the transaction includes iconic assets such as Hard Rock Stadium and the Formula One Crypto.com Miami Grand Prix, with the investment fueling continued growth across Ross's diverse South Florida-based sports and entertainment portfolio. Ares will acquire a 10% stake, while Tsai and Weisberg together will hold a 3% interest pending final closing of the agreements. The minority non-controlling interest sale was approved by the NFL at the league meeting on Wednesday, December 11th. So it's been a busy day already for the NFL meetings. The Philadelphia Eagles, I believe they also had a percent of equity that was approved for their franchise at over an $8 billion valuation for the Eagles. So this is something that it was 8% of the Eagles at $8.3 billion was approved for sale. So this is big time, like cash infusion into some of these organizations. And the league has just recently approved private equity to take on minority ownership of NFL franchises. I am hardly surprised that Stephen Ross and the Dolphins are kind of at the early stages and steps of this, especially with how Stephen Ross has handled the, as it's described, the sports and entertainment portfolio down there in Miami Gardens with the F1 track and Hard Rock Stadium. Ross, South Florida native who acquired the Dolphins in 2009. This is continuing from the team release. Has spent 15 years investing in and revolutionizing South Florida sports and entertainment landscape. He has spearheaded and privately financed more than $1 billion of sweeping modernization efforts in the region, elevating Hard Rock Stadium into a premier global sports and entertainment destination. These upgrades have secured stadium's role for marquee events and generated billions in economic impact, including Super Bowl, Formula One Crypto, Miami Grand Prix, Miami Open Tennis Tournament, 2026 FIFA World Cup, and high-profile concerts such as Taylor Swift's Eras Tour. This is, I think, what's really interesting about this is the Dolphins have gotten all of these rave reviews as an organization for the resources that they make available to the players. And you can say whatever you want about Stephen Ross as the owner of the team, and there's been black eyes and there's been mistakes and there's been mismanaged things, as there is with the vast majority of franchises across the NFL. The one thing he's not afraid to do is invest in his product. And I would much rather have ownership with that kind of attitude, then compare and contrast that to what is going on in, say, Cincinnati right now. And it's not meant to throw the Bengals under the bus, but like Mike Brown, the owner of the Bengals, they signed Joe Burrow to a contract extension that was a market reset contract. And it was a really big deal because the Bengals historically have not been a big cash flow spend organization. And now they've played hardball with Jamar Chase, and Jamar Chase is on pace to win the Triple Crown from a receiving standpoint in the NFL this year. He's putting up monster numbers. They offered him a contract before the season. It didn't get done. Chase bet on himself. And you could, in theory, put the franchise tag on him after letting the 5 years play out, this, that, the other thing. Like, you could do that if you're Cincinnati. But then there's the T. Higgins element, and Joe Burrow's being asked about playing with T. Higgins, and Joe Burrow's saying, I plan to do what needs to be done to make sure that he's still here, but those players aren't being taken care of. And cash doesn't solve everything. But it gives you flexibility to maintain a competitive window. Case in point, look at what's happening in Philadelphia, who's been one of the teams across missed quarterback draft picks with Carson Wentz, across missed head coaching firings like they had with Doug Peterson, and the transition away from Chip Kelly to Doug, and from Doug to Nick Sirianni, and like Howie Roseman and Jeffrey Lurie have been there through that entire transition for the organization. The one thing that Jeffrey Lurie has always done for Philadelphia is invested and spent in his organization. And getting the right people in place to run the operations is kind of the other part. But if you're not willing to invest in your product, there's only so much you can do. And the fact that Miami and additionally Philadelphia, with their valuation at over $8 billion and 8% sale, and I don't have the numbers for what the valuation is for the Dolphins, but the valuation, I would imagine the fact that it includes the stadium, it includes the organization, the football team, it includes the entire grounds that have the F1 track and the Miami Open with the tennis courts. Like, there's a lot of extra that goes into this empire, if you will, of resources that are down here with what Stephen Ross has invested into and created and built. And it has a chance to be his lasting legacy as the owner of the franchise. But having private equity that comes in creates more liquidity for continued investment into this organization. And when you have players that are getting big contracts and you're in a position where you're probably going to be looking at potentially doing a lot of continued check signing for restructures for salary cap purposes and proration and this, that, the other thing, having liquidity matters, because there's some teams that don't have liquidity and they can't do those things. And as a result, they pretty much just say, well, whatever checks we sign this year, we have to, that's our cap for the year. And that is not going to play competitively well in the league landscape relative to how other teams are able to operate because they have liquidity in cash. That is how this news impacts the Dolphins. And I don't even have this on the right-hand third here because I sat down to record and this came out. And I said, well, we got to talk about it. But it is a non-controlling stake with Ares Management taking on 10% and Cy and Weisberg together holding 3% interest in the organization. We'll see what else comes out as a result of this approved sale by the league in the days to come. I'm Kyle Krabs. That's going to do it for us here on Locked on Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys, as always, for checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. We are out of here.